Hello, poker players. This is Steve Salbrady again. One of the toughest decisions a tournament player must make is whether to call a jam or not. Game theory has some solutions for this, but assumes that the jammer has the correct range for jamming. This is rarely the case in a real tournament. This gets even more difficult when we are faced with multiple jammers with relatively deep stacks. Today we will discuss such a situation when we have ace-king. Enjoy. This is a situation that occurred in a recent WSOP circuit event played at the Horseshoe in Las Vegas. The under the gun player open jams with a 25 big blind stack. He hasn't been very active so far, so I don't know what his range might be for jamming here. It folds to the button, who overjams with her 60 big blind stack. She has been very active, fairly loose, and very aggressive. It folds to me in the big blind. Should I call with my ace-king? Lest you think that this is a very unusual situation, the same scenario occurred on the very next hand. Only the second time the jammer was by the current under the gun +1 player, and the same player overjammed. So should we call? We can try to answer this question by using several methods. My first go-to method is to use GTO Wizard. Although GTO Wizard assumes that our opponents are playing perfectly, it is still useful to know what a perfect response should be. Then we could use Flopzilla, but that's not practical in a three-way pot, so we use Hold EQ instead, which is actually a sub-program of Flopzilla now. This allows us to set up a range for each villain. Then we can see what the ace-king equity would actually be against them. We also have some squishy ways to analyze our situation. For example, ICM and the principle of chip preservation would nudge us towards folding, and the principle of chip utility might nudge us towards calling. The first thing I usually do when I have a strategy question is to look at GTO Wizard. This is a solution pane for the model similar to my actual situation. This model assumes 25 big blind effective stacks, which is the effective stacks for the original jammer. Since our 30 big blind stack is in jeopardy if we lose to the button, we should also look at the 30 big blind stack solution. So the under the gun player jams and the button calls on our model, and the action is on the big blind. That's us. We can see from the panel at the lower right that this is a pure strategy fold. Calling would be a 5.16 big blind mistake. Ace-king suited shows a similar answer, which is a pure strategy fold too. But this answer seems preposterous. How can it be negative chip EV to call here? Well, the problem is that GTO Wizard is suffering from solver noise. This is a situation in which the GTO Wizard solution does not provide trustworthy answers because the situation is very rare. In fact, in this situation, the GTO Wizard does not have any range at all for jamming, for open jamming with 25 big blinds, and has no range for over jamming because we all have the same stack size. In fact, when you try to implement this solution, a warning panel pops up, which leads you to this web page, which is entitled Understanding Nash Distance, and it'll explain to you why GTO Wizard has problems with some solutions. So we can't really trust this result. In fact, GTO Wizard doesn't like its solutions unless the effective stacks are 14 big blinds or less. So I explored other solutions near this one, near the 25 big blind effective stack one, such as 20 big blind stacks, where the answer seems to converge, or 30 big blind effective stacks, where it also converges with a much different number, or at least there's positive chip EVs for calling. But I expect that a well-converged GTO solution for 30 big blind stacks would have ace-king offsuit as a pure strategy call with an EV of just a few big blinds. But that doesn't mean we should call. GTO Wizard assumes perfect opponents who are jamming and calling with the proper range. But what is a proper GTO range in this situation here? It's hard to know what GTO Wizard is assuming here, and how close that they would match the jamming and overjamming ranges of our actual villains. I think we should ignore GTO Wizard for this type of situation. Since we can't trust the GTO Wizard solution, we'll have to do this the old-fashioned way, with an equity calculation. In the old days, we would use Poker Stove. Now we use Flopzilla, which has a module called Hold EQ, which works just like the old Poker Stove program. We can fire up the Hold EQ module and we get a panel like this. Then we choose the ranges we want to use for our two villains, which can be anything we believe to be true for this hand. Here I use a fairly tight range for both villains, such as pocket tens and better and ace queen and better. Next we choose our own hand, which is ace king offsuit for this hand. Then we click on the calculate button and wait a few seconds. The numbers you see in the equity, win, and tie cells change until the calculation converges. Then we click the calculate button again to stop the model from running. We can see that our equity is only 28.4% and we will win only 20.6% of the time. These differ because we expect to tie about 16.6% of the time. When we consider that our pot odds are roughly 2 to 1, or 33.3%, we do not have enough equity to call these jams. Things get even worse for us if the jammer's range is even tighter than this. Let's model this for a somewhat looser jam. Here we give the villains ranges of 7s plus and ace 9 plus. Now we have a somewhat tighter equity, higher equity, and higher win percentages. And we tie less often, but depending on how we view ties, we still don't have enough equity to call these jams, or just barely enough. We can run as many equity calculations as we wish, but my conclusion here is the same as it was on the table. I thought I had somewhat less than a 33% equity in the pot and 33% pot odds. So depending on the ranges that we assign our villains, we might be able to eke out a small positive expectation, but it's close at best. So my conclusion is that this is probably a negative chip EV in reality. We also have some squishy ways to analyze this hand. For me, a squishy analysis is one for which we don't have a strong mathematical argument to use. The first of these squishy reasons to fold is based on the independent chip model. The ICM meme is that a chip won is worth less than a chip lost. This makes any neutral chip EV action a negative ICM EV action. This means that we would lose money. Even a modestly positive chip EV action can become an ICM EV loser, and we don't need to be near the bubble for this to be true. While it is possible to calculate the exact impact of ICM that ICM has on our EV, we can rarely do this in real time while we are playing. A second squishy reason to fold is chip preservation. This is one of Daniel Negreanu's tournament principles. Of course, we can take this too far, but when we have a reasonably healthy stack, like the 30 big blinds that we actually had, and are faced with an action that can bust us or cripple us, we should be seriously considering folding and waiting for a better spot. This is a squishy situation. There are also some squishy reasons to call these jams. The main one is chip utility. The chip utility meme says that a chip won is worth more than a chip lost, which is just the opposite of the ICM meme. Whereas we can calculate the value of an ICM penalty if we know the size of everyone's stack and the prize pool distribution, there is no quantitative way to calculate the value of chip utility. But most tournament players know that a bigger stack is more valuable than just the random value of our chips that ICM calculates. If we know how to wield it, a large stack has a power out of proportion to its size, since smaller stacks are usually reluctant to call a jam lightly. In fact, that is part of the power of the button's over jam. It puts pressure on the other players behind her. There is also the power of conventional wisdom, which is to call a jam with ace-king unless the jammer is very tight. It seems that this advice doesn't change very much with multiple jammers. So when faced with this decision in the tournament, I thought that most experts would call here. And like most players, I wanted to make the best decision that I could. Ultimately, I considered three factors to be most important while I was actually playing the hand. The first was that I expected the jammers' ranges to be fairly tight, since both of them had healthy stacks. As a result of this, I thought my equity was not as good as the 2-to-1 pot odds I was being given. And finally, I considered chip preservation to be an important principle, especially when we have stacks between, say, 20 and 40 big blinds. So I folded. On the next hand, I had the same situation, and I folded again. If my decision was correct the first time, it was likely correct the second time, though I did see the hand that Miss Overjammer played the first time, so it was tempting to call the second time because she had overjammed with a somewhat weak hand. About one orbit later, an early position player jammed with about 14 big blinds, and it folded to me with ace-king suited. This is a much different situation since I have only one villain, and he did not have me covered. Now we have a well-behaved GTO wizard model which says we have a pure strategy call with about 5.85 big blinds EV. Again, this depends on the range we put Mr. Jammer on, but with only 14 big blinds, his range could be quite a bit wider than the 25 big blind Jammer 2 hands or an orbit earlier. So I did call this time, and I won. There are several important lessons today. First, calling multi-way jams from relatively large stacks when we also have a healthy stack is probably not the optimal play, even when we have a hand as strong as ace-king. Second, GTO Wizard doesn't always provide trustworthy answers. Solver noise can distort our answers when the villain deviates too much from what GTO Wizard expects. Third, the solution is much more reliable when the jammer has a small stack and there is no caller. And finally, we can use Hold'em EQ or Hold EQ to find our equities in multi-way potch. The better we can peg our opponent's ranges, the more accurate our answer will be. That's all for today.